My name is Brooke Calloway. I'm 25 years old. On a Tuesday morning, my boss called me into her glass office, slid a termination letter across her desk, and said, "You just don't have what it takes to lead here, Brooke. Some people are built for this industry. You're not one of them." I nodded, signed where she pointed, and walked out with a cardboard box of desk plants. 4 days later, an attorney called me about an aunt I'd met exactly twice in my entire life, and by Friday, I owned the one company in this city my former boss had spent 15 years trying to destroy. If this story already has you sitting up straight, hit subscribe and drop your city and local time in the comments. I read every single one. Let me take you back to where it actually started. I grew up in Tulsa, Oklahoma, the only child of a single mother who worked nights at a packaging plant for most of my childhood. We didn't have much, but my mother made sure I never felt the lack of it the way some kids do. She was clever about stretching a dollar, generous with her time even when she had almost none of it left over, and absolutely unwavering about one thing. School came first every single time, no exceptions. I studied marketing at Oklahoma State on a partial scholarship, graduated in 2022 with a respectable GPA and no real connections in the industry, and took the first decent offer I got, an entry-level marketing coordinator role at a mid-sized regional events company called Castellan Premier Events, run by a woman named Diane Castellan. Diane had built Castellan Premier from nothing over 15 years into the dominant corporate events company in the region: conferences, product launches, executive retreats, the kind of work that requires equal parts logistics and charm. She was, by every external measure, an impressive businesswoman. She was also, I learned within my first 3 months, someone who ran her office on a very specific and very narrow definition of who deserved to rise within it. There was an unofficial inner circle at Castellan Premier, people Diane had personally mentored, invited to her house for dinner, taken to industry conferences as her guest. I was never invited into that circle, despite consistently strong performance reviews. Despite landing 2 new corporate accounts in my second year that brought in more revenue than any other coordinator's combined client list. Diane's praise for me, when it came at all, was always oddly specific and oddly limited. Good with details, reliable, never talented or promising, the words she reserved for the people she'd actually decided to invest in. I want to pause here and ask you something. Have you ever worked somewhere that quietly decided, very early on, exactly how far you were allowed to go, regardless of how hard you actually worked? If that's ever happened to you, type ceiling in the comments below. I think a lot of you know exactly the feeling I'm describing. In late 2023, a senior account manager position opened up, the kind of promotion that would have meant a meaningful raise, a small team to manage, and a real foothold toward eventually running my own division. I applied. I'd earned it on paper, and most of my colleagues quietly assumed I'd get it. Diane gave the position instead to a man named Trent Wallace, who had been at the company 8 months, who had no events background prior to joining, and who happened to be the son of one of Diane's oldest personal friends from her country club. When I asked Diane carefully and professionally what specifically I could work on to be considered for the next opening, she gave me an answer I still remember word for word. "Brooke, honestly, some people just have an instinct for this industry that can't really be taught. Trent has it. I think you do good, solid work, but I'm not sure you have that same instinct." I stayed another year anyway, partly because I needed the paycheck, partly because some stubborn part of me wanted to prove her assessment wrong through sheer accumulated results rather than simply walking away. By early 2025, I was managing client relationships that generated nearly a third of the company's annual revenue, training 2 newer coordinators Diane had hired specifically because, in her words, she wanted them to learn good habits early from someone reliable. Reliable, again, never talented, never promising. In March of 2025, Diane called me into her glass-walled corner office on a Tuesday morning, the kind of office that let everyone on the floor watch exactly what was happening to you in real time without hearing a single word of it. She slid a folder across her desk. Inside was a termination letter, dated that same day, citing restructuring of the account management division as the official reason. I asked her, as calmly as I could manage while my hands were visibly shaking, what restructuring specifically meant, given that I was, by every metric the company tracked internally, one of the strongest performers in that exact division. She looked at me for a long moment and then said the sentence I will never fully forget. You just don't have what it takes to lead here, Brooke. Some people are built for this industry. You're not one of them. I think you'll find something that's a better fit for your actual strengths. I signed the severance paperwork because contesting it in the moment felt both impossible and pointless, packed a cardboard box with 3 desk plants and a framed photo of my mother, and walked out of Castellan premiere events for what I genuinely believed at the time was the last time in my life I would ever think about that building again. 4 days later, on a Saturday afternoon, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize, area code from somewhere outside Oklahoma I couldn't immediately place. A woman named Patrice Okafor, identifying herself as an estate attorney, told me she was calling regarding the estate of my aunt, Lorraine Calloway, my father's older sister, a woman I had met exactly twice in my entire life, once at my parents' wedding before I was born, captured only in photographs, and once in person, briefly, at a family funeral when I was perhaps 9 years old, a tall, sharp-eyed woman who'd given me a $20 bill and told me to buy something useful with it, not candy. My father had died when I was 6, and his side of the family had drifted almost entirely out of our lives afterward, partly through simple geographic distance and partly, I now understand, through a complicated estrangement between Lorraine and my father that predated my birth and that nobody in my family had ever fully explained to me. Lorraine, it turned out, had spent the better part of 4 decades building her own events and hospitality company based out of Dallas, a company called Meridian Hospitality Group, specializing in large-scale corporate retreats and luxury conference logistics across the southern half of the country. She had never married, had no children, and had apparently, according to Patrice, tracked my life from a careful, deliberate distance for years, through occasional updates from a mutual cousin, without ever once reaching out directly. She died in late February of 2025, of complications from a long illness she'd kept almost entirely private, and her will, updated most recently in 2023, named me as the sole beneficiary of her entire estate, including full ownership of Meridian Hospitality Group. I sat on my apartment floor for almost 20 minutes after that call, genuinely unable to process what I'd just been told. Patrice, sensing my disbelief, gently explained that Lorraine had left a personal letter specifically for me, to be delivered alongside the formal estate paperwork, and asked if I'd be willing to fly to Dallas the following week to begin the transition process in person. I want to ask you something here. Have you ever discovered, in the space of a single phone call, that someone you barely knew had been quietly watching your entire life from a distance, waiting for the right moment to hand you something enormous? If that's ever happened to you, I want to hear about it in the comments. I flew to Dallas the following Tuesday, exactly 1 week after Diane had fired me. Patrice's office was modest, professional, lined with case files. She handed me a sealed envelope first, before any of the formal paperwork, and asked if I wanted privacy to read it. I did. Lorraine's letter was short, written in careful, slightly shaky handwriting that suggested it had been written during one of her harder weeks. She explained, briefly, that her estrangement from my father had been over a business disagreement decades earlier that she'd never fully resolved before he died, and that she'd spent years afterward quietly regretting the distance, watching from afar as I grew up, occasionally hearing small updates through the cousin who'd kept loose contact with my mother. I don't expect this to undo decades of absence, Brooke, she wrote. I'm not asking you to forgive an old woman's pride. I built Meridian because I never had children of my own to build something for, and somewhere along the way, without ever telling anyone, I started building it for you instead, even though you didn't know it. Run it however you see fit. Sell it if you want to. I only ask that you run it the way I tried to, eventually, after I learned the hard way what kind of leadership actually lasts, by noticing the people everyone else overlooks, and giving them the chance nobody gave you. Patrice then walked me through the actual scope of what I'd inherited, and this is the part of the story that I think genuinely surprised me more than the inheritance itself. Meridian Hospitality Group, over the previous decade, had grown into the single largest direct competitor to Castellan Premier Events across the regional corporate events market, the two companies regularly bidding against each other for the same large accounts, with Meridian winning a steadily increasing share of that business in recent years specifically because, as Patrice put it, Lorraine built a reputation for actually developing the junior staff other firms overlooked, which made client-facing teams unusually loyal and unusually good. I had, without any prior knowledge whatsoever, just inherited controlling ownership of the one company that had spent 15 years quietly outperforming the woman who'd just told me I didn't have what it takes. I spent the following 6 weeks in a kind of careful, deliberate transition process, working closely with Meridian's existing general manager, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Felicia Marsh who had run the company's daily operations for Lorraine for the past 9 years and who, I quickly learned, had genuinely loved Lorraine as both a boss and a mentor. Felicia explained, candidly, in our first real working meeting, that Lorraine had specifically built much of Meridian's later growth strategy around poaching strong, undervalued talent from competitors who'd failed to recognize what they had, and that, over the years, Lorraine had occasionally mentioned, almost in passing, hearing about a sharp young coordinator over at Castellan through industry circles, someone Diane Castellan apparently complained about regularly at networking events for being competent but lacking real vision. Language that, once I heard it repeated back to me, sounded uncomfortably, precisely familiar. I didn't fully understand what that meant until almost 2 months into running Meridian, when Felicia, reviewing some old internal notes Lorraine had kept on competitor intelligence, found a single handwritten line dated from sometime in late 2024. Castellan's coordinator, B. Calloway, landed 2 of their best accounts, getting nowhere there. Watch this one. Could be exactly what we need eventually, if Diane keeps underestimating her the way she underestimates everyone who isn't already comfortable. I sat with that note for a long time. My aunt, a woman I had met exactly twice in my life, had apparently been quietly tracking my career through industry gossip for at least a year before her death, recognizing something in my work that my own direct supervisor had spent 2 years actively refusing to see. I want to pause again here and tell you something important, because this isn't simply a revenge story, even though I understand exactly how it might look from the outside. I made a deliberate decision, in those first months running Meridian, not to use the company as a weapon against Castellan Premier out of any sense of personal vendetta. I genuinely believed, and still believe, that doing so would have dishonored exactly the kind of leadership Lorraine described wanting to build in her letter. What I did instead was simpler, and in some ways more satisfying. I ran Meridian well. I implemented a formal mentorship structure for junior staff that Lorraine had apparently always wanted, but never fully built out herself, paired with clear, transparent promotion criteria based entirely on measurable performance rather than personal favoritism. Within 4 months, 2 of Meridian's junior coordinators, both of whom Felicia told me privately had been quietly passed over for promotions elsewhere before joining us, were leading their own client portfolios. The market noticed. 2 of Castellan Premier's longtime corporate clients moved their annual contracts to Meridian that summer, not because I personally solicited them, but because, as one client's procurement director told Felicia directly during the transition call, your team actually develops people instead of just managing accounts until they burn out and leave. I later learned, through industry channels rather than anything I sought out myself, that one of those clients had been a Castellan account I personally built from nothing during my second year there, the same account Diane had cited, somewhat ironically, in my own performance reviews as evidence of my reliable execution, rather than any real strategic talent. In September of 2025, almost exactly 6 months after my termination, I ran into Trent Wallace, the man who'd been promoted over me, at a regional industry conference in Dallas. He approached me, visibly uncomfortable, to say he'd heard about the inheritance through industry gossip and wanted to congratulate me on the unexpected opportunity. I thanked him, genuinely, without bitterness, because by that point I'd found that I genuinely didn't carry much bitterness left toward him specifically. He'd simply been handed something he hadn't earned by someone who valued comfort and familiarity over actual merit, and I'd long since stopped needing his failure to validate my own success. He mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that Castellan Premier had quietly lost 3 more accounts that year, and that morale in the office had reportedly cratered, with 2 senior coordinators leaving for competitors within the same quarter. I never spoke directly to Diane Castellan again after the day she fired me. I heard, secondhand, through a former coworker I'd stayed loosely in touch with, that she'd mentioned my inheritance once at a company meeting, apparently attempting to frame it as pure luck rather than anything connected to actual skill. Some people just get lucky breaks. That's the industry sometimes. A comment that struck me when I heard about it as a strange, almost perfect echo of the exact kind of dismissive language she'd used to explain away every other person at her company she'd ever quietly decided wasn't worth investing in. I run Meridian Hospitality Group full-time now, with Felicia as my operating partner and genuine friend, a role I never once expected to find myself in 2 years ago, packing desk plants into a cardboard box in a parking lot, genuinely believing a woman I'd worked for and trusted when she told me, flatly, that I simply didn't have what it takes. I think about Lorraine often, a woman I barely knew in life who somehow, from a distance, saw something in my work that the person standing directly across a desk from me for 2 years refused to see. I keep her handwritten note about me. Watch this one. Framed on a small shelf in my own office now, not as a trophy, but as a reminder of something I want to carry into every hiring decision I make for the rest of my career. That the people worth building something real with are very often exactly the ones everyone else has already decided to overlook. If you've ever been told, directly to your face, that you simply don't have what it takes by someone who turned out to be profoundly wrong, I want to hear about it. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from, and tell me honestly, do you think Diane Castellan ever truly understood what she lost the day she fired me? Or do people like that simply never learn? Subscribe if this story meant something to you. I read every single comment.